Please welcome Chloe Valdery.
What's up, Boston? That was not. Come on. What's up, Boston? It's been a while since I've been here, but Boston in many ways represents the birthplace of my Israel engagement activity. So I have my roots here, and I'm very excited to be back. I remember in 2014 being here and working with the IACT program, and I was a part of panels and rallies with my friend Daniel Mail. For those of you who may have been here at that time, you may remember that it was the heart of the Gaza war, so it was very hectic. There were protests and counter-protests happening, but it was an incredible time, and I'm very happy and fortunate to be back to address you this evening. I was in Africa for 2 weeks, for the first time actually, and as you can imagine, it was an incredibly moving and powerful trip, and I was in South Africa to be particular. And to me, Africa represents the birthplace of all music, all rhythm, all sound, which as you saw in the film, I'm in love with, and all storytelling. So I'd like to begin with a story, if that's okay with you all. Is that okay? Awesome. So when I was 14 years old, I attended a predominantly African-American school in New Orleans called McDonough 35. And before Hurricane Katrina made landfall on McDonough 35, this school was very well known for its level of academic rigorousness and quality. But unfortunately, that changed after Katrina. And I found myself in an environment where it wasn't challenging. My peers and my classmates weren't valuing an education, and they were interested in other things. And in many cases, there were fights at this school, sometimes on a daily basis, sometimes on a weekly basis. And I'm telling you this story because this would be the landscape into which I would actually find myself becoming more and more interested in the Jewish story. So one day I walk into Spanish class, and my teacher decides to show a film called Freedom Riders. How many of you have seen this film? So some of you. For those of you who haven't seen it, this will be a spoiler alert, so I apologize in advance. So Freedom Riders is a true story. It's a film about a school in LA filled with students from all types of backgrounds, black, white, Latino, Asian, etc. Many of these students come from gang-related backgrounds, broken homes, and the one thing these students have in common with each other is that they hate each other. They all hate each other. Now imagine if you're a teacher and you have to engage these students. You have to get them interested in an education. And you try day in and day out to do this, but it never works. Until one day, there's a turning point. And I'll try to set the scene for you. One day in class, a Latino boy at the back of the class draws a picture, a degrading picture, a dehumanizing picture of the black boy sitting in front of the class. And he passes it along to his classmates, and they giggle and snicker, and they pass it along until finally it reaches the hands of the black boy in the front of the class, who sees it and begins to cry. And the teacher finally sees what's happening, looks at the picture, and tells the students, "Put the books and the pens away." She says to them, "You think you're so big and bad in your gangs, hating each other, being fueled by prejudice and bigotry? You are nothing compared to the most infamous gang in human history. And this gang didn't simply take over cities, it took over countries. It wiped everyone out. And it wiped out 6 million in the process. Just because it was fueled by bigotry and hatred. And it started out poor and angry and bitter, like you. And it started out drawing things, depicting people that it didn't like in dehumanizing ways, just like you did. And that's how a Holocaust happened. And do you know what these students said to her? They said, "Why should we listen to anything you say to us? You're trying to teach us grammar, but after we get out of this class, we have to get into the real world, and we have to deal with what's outside these four walls. We have to deal with gangs shooting us up. We have to deal with broken homes. What are you doing that's actually making a difference in our lives? At least if we fight on behalf of our gangs, we'll get respect. At least even if we die on behalf of our gangs, we will die warriors, and we will get respect from the world. And she said, you think that if you die fighting for your gangs, the world is going to give you respect? And they said, yes. And she said, you know what's going to happen when you die? Your bodies will rot in the grave, and the world will move on with its life. Because all you ever did to contribute to society was draw pictures depicting bigotry and discrimination of others. And a hush descended upon the crowd. And the Latino boy in the back of the room raised his hand and said, the Holocaust, what is that? And the teacher turns to the class and says, how many of you have heard of the Holocaust? And in a sea of 20 14-year-olds, one person raises their hand. And then she asks, how many of you have ever been threatened with a gun before? And the entire classroom raises their hands. This is the environment that she's dealing with. But then she begins to realize that this is the landscape to introduce the story of Anne Frank. And they're able to relate to the story of Anne Frank because, like Anne Frank, they too were being chased by bullets placed in the hands of people who didn't like them simply because of how they looked. And once they saw themselves and their stories in the story of Anne Frank, they began to see value in their own lives. And once they began to see value in their own lives, they began to love themselves. And once they began to love themselves, they began to love each other. And these students would go on to become some of the first in their families to graduate from high school and college in many cases. And my 14-year-old idealistic self, seeing this, realized that there is a synergy between the Jewish story and how it has inspired others in their own search for liberation, in their own search for self-awareness and self-empowerment. My 14-year-old self at the time realized that there was a relationship between the Jewish story and how it has inspired peoples throughout all the earth for thousands of years. I began to realize that the Magen David, as a symbolic embodiment of the Jewish story, is the pulse, is the beat, is the symbol that the song of liberation is grounded in. And where this symbol is present, freedom resounds. This symbol, this Star of David, was present in the hearts of slaves who escaped from the south to the north on the Underground Railroad, who referred to their Harriet Tubman as Moses, who sang to each other, wade in the water, wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. Referencing a story that we will all be celebrating next week. The story of when God split the Red Sea so that the Israelites could pass through to freedom, troubling the water. Where this symbol is present, freedom resounds. It was there in the hearts and minds of the children and grandchildren of slaves who marched through the South, who ushered in a new era of freedom in America, and who in 1975 signed a letter in the pages of the New York Times affirming their love and affinity for Zionism. You see, because Rosa Parks and Coretta Scott King and Rayard Bustin understood that Zionism, being the liberation for the Jewish people, meant their own liberation. Where this symbol is present, freedom resounds. It was there in the hearts of Ashkenazi Jews, who through the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries were shackled by European systems of oppression. There were times when Jews could not walk down the streets in Europe, the same streets as their Gentile counterparts. There were times when mobs would come into Jewish neighborhoods and lynch men, women, and children at will simply because they could, simply because they felt like it. And we take that for granted. Until one day, the Ashkenazi Jew remembered how his people wept by the rivers of Babylon when they thought of their land. Until one day, the Ashkenazi Jew remembered the anguish of exile. And indeed, Theodor Herzl did an initiative that would lead to one of the most revolutionary movements of the 20th century, leading to the reestablishment of the State of Israel, where this symbol is present, freedom resounds. It was there in the hearts of Middle Eastern Jews, who themselves also were subject to sources of Islamic oppression, who had to pay extra taxes in North Africa, denoting their inferior status. And indeed, when the State of Israel was reestablished, mobs often entered, mobs often pillaged, mobs often murdered. But these Middle Eastern Jews looked to the east, and they escaped. And when they escaped, they returned. And when they returned, they were reborn. Where this symbol is present, freedom resounds. Now, there are many more stories to tell and many more songs to sing. But what song will Boston sing? And what song will the Northeast region sing? And what song will America sing? Because I'm sure you may know, and I'm sure you have heard, of the anti-Semitism in academic institutions. I'm sure you have heard of Jewish graveyards being toppled over. I'm sure you have heard of individuals hijacking movements for anti-Zionist objectives. And so you may be wondering, how can a song be sung when people are promoting the BDS movement on campus? How can a song be sung when people are associating Zionism with racism? How can a song be sung when people are holding Israel Apartheid Week events on campus? Well, I can tell you, Boston, that in the past 3 years of doing Israel engagement, I am hopeful, and I have great hope in you all, that this will be the generation to sing a new song. That this will be the generation to tell the world once more that where this symbol is present, freedom resounds. That this will be the generation that tells the world again that when we speak Zionism, we speak freedom. That this will be the generation that tells the world that Zionism represents that moment when that young child, that young teen, in that dilapidated home, that gang-related background, that broken down society, asks a very simple question that Zionism embodies. From the child in LA, to the child in Boston, to the child in Soweto, to the child in Poland, to the child in Morocco, to the child in Jerusalem, to the child in Gaza, to the child in Syria, and to a little child in New Orleans who asks a very simple question. Show me what's possible. Show me what's possible. No matter the obstacle, show me what's possible. I believe that you will be the generation that tells the world once more that this is the essence of Zionism. I began with a story of my 14-year-old self, and I'll end with a similar story. When I was 17 years old in film school, a spoken word artist came to my class, and he asked the question that I have grappled with for a long time. He asked the question that we as human beings have grappled with since the dawn of time. And he asked a question that Jews, when in exile, grappled with for the longest time. He asked what made the beauty of the moon and the beauty of the sea. Did that beauty make you? Did that beauty make me? Will that make me something? Am I something? Will I be something? And the answer to all of you eager, active, engaged students remains: you always was, you still are, and you still have time to be. Thank you. And now for the awards. It is a privilege and an honor to be able to introduce the first Student Journalist Award to Ben Gladstone of Brown University. Ben?
Thank you so much for that, Chloe. And thank you to CJP and to the Consulate General of Israel to New England for this great honor. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about the importance of journalism in my own life. For me, it's been a way to articulate my ideas and give voice to my opinions. I wrote recently in Tablet magazine, for example, about the place of Jewish issues in intersectional justice movements, including a discussion on the importance of addressing anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism as intersectional challenges. That's the kind of issue that's really tough to articulate in a lot of campus spaces, but I felt able to speak that kind of message to the world through journalistic opinions writing. As students, it can feel difficult to be heard. We're young, we don't have degrees, and often it feels like people don't care what we have to say. But we really do have a voice, and we can have a really strong voice. We live and study with the future leaders of this country. And through events, through conversations, through articles in our school papers, we can really engage in activism that matters with those people. We also have the power to express our thoughts to the world through journalism. Theodore Herzl himself was a journalist, and Golda Meir found her entry to the movement through salon debates. The Zionist movement had its foundations in pamphlets, manifestos, and articles. The leading thinkers of past generations wrote the Zionist dream into reality. They wrote national liberation into the Jewish consciousness, and they wrote the Jewish state into being. Today, it's up to us to play that role. We are the next generation, and like our ideological forebears, we face serious challenges. Sharp divisions within the Jewish diaspora, hostility from Europe and the Arab world, disdain from high-profile intellectuals. But with powerful ideas and effective writing, figures like Leon Pinsker, Israel Zangwill, and Theodore Herzl rose above that same hate and disunity and wrote a revolution. Now it's our turn to fight that fight, to win the battle of ideas in America, to help our siblings across the ocean win the battle for their lives and their futures in Israel. Thank you again.